Hello, friends. We are excited that our No Small Endeavor Plus community is growing. Now, all of our friends in the No Small Endeavor orbit are intelligent, smarter than average, winsome, good-looking, while the members of NSC Plus seem especially so because they are enjoying ad-free episodes as well as special subscriber-only content once a month where we discuss habits and practices learned from our guests over the years. And those special episodes have been a lot of fun, personal and practical. I love sitting down with our producer, Jacob Lewis, and recording those for you. And so we would love to have you join us. And your NSC Plus membership helps support the show. So because of all of these things, we'd love for you to join the NSC Plus family. Just go to nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up on our subscriber-only episodes today. Again, go now, nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up. See you there. You're listening to No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. I'm Lee C. Camp. We are pleased on occasion to share with you an episode from other podcasts, which we find important and helpful. And you may have heard our episode with renowned psychologist David DeSteno on his book, How God Works. I really very much enjoyed my conversation with Dave. I found his approach helpful and very refreshing, and it was a really delightful conversation. On his podcast by the same name, How God Works, Dave talks with religious leaders, scientists, intellectuals from various fields, and explores the overlap between scientific research and the teachings of various wisdom and faith traditions. The episode we share today I find particularly helpful. It's one on hope and the cultivation of hopefulness in a world marred by seemingly intractable violence and hostility. You'll hear Dave interview Pulitzer-prize winning journalist Nicholas Kristof, who discusses ways he's learned to maintain hopefulness even while covering some of the most horrific instances of violence and war-making. And Roshi Joan Halifax, founder of Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, about the notion of wise hope, the equanimity it can bring, and the fierce compassion it can unleash. So we hope you enjoy this episode of How God Works, hosted by David DeSteno, and consider subscribing. Enjoy.
Over the past few years, a sense of hopelessness has been rising in the U.S. And it's not hard to see why. The pandemic was a gut punch. And then on its heels came rising gun violence, racial strife, increasing economic inequality, and worrying data on climate change. By the middle of 2023, surveys showed that feelings of despair hit record levels. And that was before the recent tragic events in Israel and Gaza. So as we look to the new year, it's understandable why any of us might be pessimistic. But these feelings aren't written in stone. We always have a choice. It's in these darkest of times, when all feels lost, that hope helps us find our way, not just to heal ourselves, but also the world around us. On this episode, we'll talk with New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, who through a long and storied career has covered some of the greatest pain and tragedies imaginable, about how he still finds hope in the world.
The brighter side of hope, I think what makes it work, is this sense that one can actually bring about change. I think that it's often impossible to find that follow-through unless you are animated by hope.
And we'll talk with Roshi Joan Halifax, ecologist, civil rights activist, hospice caregiver, and founder of the Upaya Zen Center, about wise hope, the equanimity it can bring, and the fierce compassion it can unleash.
Hope is not a story that is based on optimism that everything's going to be okay. Wise hope really rests in the experience of openness.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. As a journalist and opinion columnist, Nicholas Kristof has reported on some of the most bleak, horrific, and seemingly intractable conflicts around the world, for which he's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He charts his remarkable career in his upcoming memoir, Chasing Hope, which will be released later this spring. In reading it, one of the things I found most inspiring was that even given a reporting career that could have easily led to burnout, PTSD, or at the very least, a hardened and cynical view of the world, Nick possesses none of these qualities. Throughout it all, he's remained improbably hopeful. And it's that hope, in people's inherent goodness, the bettering of society, the power of journalism to effect change, that has led him to go beyond journalism, to create educational opportunities, run for political office, and even start a cidery and vineyard on the farm where he grew up in Yamal, Oregon. I've been seeing your ciders on Twitter, so I'm...
Oh, yeah. It's such a different kind of adventure for me, but it's a really fun adventure, and it's kind of my artistic outlet, and I learn a lot from it. It's been a great diversion.
And let me add, a great product. Full disclosure here, I have some in my fridge. We caught up with Nick on his family farm after he returned from covering the tragic situation in Israel and Gaza. But even among the pain and violence he saw there, he still found embers of hope.
I think there are lots of reasons to worry about it. I think the killing will continue for some time, and that creates a dynamic that makes it really hard to resolve. But what really impressed me was I spoke to people on both sides of this great gulf who had suffered deep personal losses themselves and yet somehow found it in them to forgive, to try to understand that more killing isn't going to help, to want to build bridges rather than blow them up. And, some of these were Israelis who had lost loved ones, even parents, to the Hamas attacks on October 7th. And they didn't just want to blow up Gaza forever. They wanted to try to figure out how we can build a two-state solution and go forward. And then likewise talking to Palestinians, one who lost his 10-year-old daughter and yet was still determined to try to figure out how we can work with Israelis and stop the killing on both sides and move forward. And if even these people who suffered just the worst possible losses you can imagine, if they are willing to try to find the humanity on the other side, then maybe there's hope for the rest of us. That's what I'd like to think.
Adversity, tragedy, loss, these are parts of being human. Not everyone experiences it to the same degree, and few to the extent of what Nick just described. But when adversity does touch us, we have a choice: to despair, hardening our hearts, or to be hopeful, compassionate, and to work for the good. In my lab, we've seen adversity lead people down both these paths. And while on average, more choose hope than despair, it's not always easy. How and why to make that choice was a lesson Nick first learned from his father.
My dad was a World War II refugee. He was in a concentration camp for a while. He had very little real empirical grounded reason to be hopeful. And yet I think he did have that sense of hope. And I think that helped enable him to survive the war, helped enable him to come to the U.S. and bear a son who became a journalist.
How did he balance that, a kind of rationalistic view of life, with also having hope? Because, given that he was in those terrible circumstances, the odds weren't great that it would work out well.
I'm not sure that they're exactly antagonistic. I think of them almost in separate spheres, that one can rationally calculate that things look very grim, and yet hope is this sense of emotion that things can be better. In the new memoir, I talk about being in a plane that's coming down to crash. And, rationally, the odds did not look very good as we were coming down in a jungle in Congo. And I knew that intellectually. And yet I did somehow sort of nurse this belief that in some way or another, we were going to land safely. I didn't disagree with the rational analysis, but somehow they co-inhabited my brain.
Holding two oppositional truths at once might seem illogical, but in truth, it's necessary. If you accept defeat, if you believe you can't beat the odds even though it's unlikely, the only choice is despair. And given that very few things in this world have a 100% probability of occurring, having hope makes sense. Sometimes it's the only thing that helps you keep going. And for me, personally, right now, I need something to help keep me going. It's easy to become pretty cynical pretty quickly if you watch or read the news. Many reporters sensationalize tragedies. Talk show hosts feature political fights, and social media algorithms abet doom scrolling. But to Nick, journalism done right can actually be an act of hope.
The real reporting, when people put their lives on the line, that is absolutely an act of hope. You think about journalists who are pleading to be allowed to go into Gaza right now to cover the reign of destruction. Why do they take these risks? I think it's because of some notion that we can make a difference and that bearing witness can ease that burden of suffering. If you're a pure cynic and you don't think anything matters, then what's the point of going off and covering these things? Most of us went into journalism. It certainly wasn't the money and it wasn't the business model, but I think it was some notion that we can have an impact on the world around us. And that is an element of hope.
And how you report your stories can be just as important as the facts themselves. Our brains don't respond emotionally to facts and figures. So for readers who weren't witnessing the events in person, Nick found another way to get them engaged.
One of the ways I learned this and confronted this, and it actually was my sort of introduction a little bit to social psychology, was way back during Darfur, early in Darfur. I was going off writing these pieces about these massacres. It would just so affected me. And then at the same time in New York, there were these two hawks that lived on the edge of Central Park. You remember?
So who's the celebrity this time?
It's a bird, a red-tailed hawk.
He's, without a doubt, the most famous red-tailed hawk in the world.
The building had dismantled their nest and because they didn't like the bird droppings. And all of a sudden, all of New York was up in arms about these two homeless red-tailed hawks.
Some New Yorkers protested, including building resident Mary Tyler Moore. The board reversed its decision, adding a metal support, and pale mail came back.
Everybody's stopping and just staring at this incredible, majestic creature.
And I thought, how is it that I can't generate the same outrage about hundreds of thousands of people being killed? So that led me to try to understand, how do I get people to care? There's great research on it. And, partly it's about telling individual stories and building an emotional resonance. And partly I think it's also about making people understand that if they get engaged, there can be a better outcome, that it's not hopeless, that it's not inevitable. And so very often since then, my stories and my books have had a certain arc where I describe how terrible things are, but I also do acknowledge that things can get better and that this is not inevitable.
Things can get better, but it's not always an easy path. There'll be hard times and failures along the way. So remaining hopeful requires finding ways to rebalance yourself, to regain your emotional footing. I asked Nick what helps him to do this.
In the period when I was covering some of these genocides and global tragedies, I was introducing my kids to the joys of backpacking, and my daughter and I backpacked over 6 years the entire Pacific Crest Trail from Mexico to Canada. That was so cathartic for me, and part of it was being with my daughter in a situation where neither of us could turn away and look at screens. We were stuck with each other. But partly just that majesty of nature, that awe, that really was important to me. Spinoza said something about how we always create God in our own image, and that chairs would think of God as a chair and triangles would think of God as preeminently triangular. And, I think there is maybe something to that. And in many ways, I think of the divine in terms of the mountain ranges of the California Sierras or Mount Hood here in Oregon, which I hike around every year. Maybe it's something about the permanence of the wilderness, and this mountain was here 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years from now, it'll still be there. I find that very soothing. We have the family farm where I grew up in rural Oregon. It's where I'm talking to you from right now. And again, I just find it very calming and soothing to be here on the farm, to nurse my apple trees, to make cider, and think about and try to digest what I saw.
Do you have any advice for our listeners of how they can find hope when they're looking out and seeing war and addiction and economic inequality and feeling some sense of despair?
I guess I think it's important to also have some perspective. When I was a kid, a majority of human beings throughout history had always been illiterate. And now we're approaching 90% literacy. When I graduated from college, 41% of the world's people lived in extreme poverty. Now we're down below 10%. That's incredible. Girls around much of the world just did not get an education. They were very often married at 13, 14, 15. Now girls and boys are about equally likely to get a primary school education around the world. That's just an incredible transformation. I just am so struck by this backdrop of progress that I don't think we adequately acknowledge in the world. And I think it's unfortunate that intellectuals in particular, we want to push back and say, oh, but things are awful. And it seems disloyal to all the problems in the world to allow a little nanosecond of applause for the progress. But I think that it's worth acknowledging this imperfect, incomplete progress, not for complacency, but to motivate us that we can solve some of these problems and we can make real progress against child mortality, against disease, against war. And I think we're more likely to move forward and address these problems if we do recognize that backdrop of progress, because that gives us hope.
And how about for parents with young children? They may not be able to understand the statistics and the logic of the arguments we're making, but yet they can see TV and see what's going on. I'm wondering, you said your own father helped you understand the importance of hope. Do you have any advice for parents with young children?
So I think that two really important tools we can equip children with are, one, empathy. Empathy is something that can be learned and cultivated, partly about learning about other people, putting oneself in other people's shoes. Reading about other people simply makes one a little more empathetic. And so I think it's important to try to build those empathy muscles in children. And the other is self-efficacy skills, that when they are children, that they're not just passive subjects and recipients of learning, but they can do things. And in school, I think there should be more efforts at getting students involved and active and organized. And for some kids, it'll be athletics. Other kids, it'll be student government. Others, it'll be student journalism. There are all kinds of ways to encourage that. But to give them the muscles to feel that they can do things on their own and make a difference in the world.
Roshi Joan Halifax is the founder and head teacher of the Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But her life wasn't spent sitting on a meditation cushion.
A good part of my life has been spent in situations that are fundamentally deemed as hopeless. In the 60s, I was an anti-war activist and a civil rights worker. I've been in the end-of-life care field since the early 1970s. Also, I worked for 6 years as a volunteer in death row and maximum security at the penitentiary of New Mexico, plus being a long-term climate activist and also a feminist. All of these are kind of pretty, quotes, hopeless situations. Work that could induce futility. You know, I often say I was born for this time. This era of catastrophe and of extreme threat brings the worst out in many people, but also brings out a quality of strength and also of wisdom.
We often hear this term toxic positivity, which is this sense that for the world to be right, for the world to be normal, I should be happy most of the time. And if there is any suffering, then something's wrong and I should take a pill or do something else. You know, we see this with death too, right? We often put to the side, institutionalize people who are going through that stage so we don't have to see that part of life. And so what role do you think accepting that there is adversity, there is pain, and that's a normal part of life, that not facing that is kind of making it in some ways, or do you think it is making it harder in some ways for us to have hope? Because we assume when something goes wrong, it's all going to hell.
You know, there are so many ways that we bypass. You know, one is through toxic positivity, is this kind of aversion to suffering, to conflict, to difficulties. And yet we know in terms of the development of one's character, it's exactly those adversities that build strength. People who go through intensive suffering and in the right circumstances, with the right causes and conditions, come out of that experience actually strengthened and more hopeful.
As Roshi points out, adversity and tragedy can bring out the worst in us, but also the best. They can evoke anger, greed and despair, or hope, empathy and compassion. Almost all spiritual traditions advise us to choose hope. But that leaves how? How can we be brave enough to choose hope and stick with it in the face of improbable odds and past failures? One key, according to Roshi, is to distinguish between different types of hope.
I think it's important to look at what we consider to be ordinary hope in order to understand wise hope. And, you know, someone who is ordinarily hopeful, if you will, there's a kind of desire, an aspiration for a particular outcome. And that outcome might be well different from what actually happens. And then not getting what you hope for can breed resentment, it can breed futility. And also, there's always the shadow of fear in the background of conventional hope.
What do you mean by that?
In other words, you hope for something, you want an outcome, but it might not turn out that way. And at the least, the preconscious level, there's something in your body that feels like, I might not get what I want. And that's what I'm talking about. Fear is always, it's not necessarily in the foreground, but it's hovering in the background of conventional hope. Hope is not a story that is based on optimism that everything's going to be okay. We don't know how things are going to turn out. We don't know what outcomes will unfold. Wise hope really rests in the experience of openness, of not knowing, of not being attached to outcome. It's a kind of atmosphere that is saturating our psyche, if you will, that lives with possibility. I want to read something from one of my favorite authors, Barbara Kingsolver, when she's making this distinction between optimism and hope. She says, I've been thinking a lot lately about the difference between being optimistic and being hopeful. And then she writes, I would say that I'm a hopeful person, although not necessarily optimistic. And here's how I would describe it. She says, the pessimist would say, it's going to be a terrible winter. We're all going to die. The optimist would say, okay, it'll be all right. Don't think about it. And then she says, I love this. A hopeful person would say, maybe someone will still be alive in February. So I'm going to put some potatoes in the root cellar just in case. And then later she writes, hope is a mode of resistance and that it's a gift I try to cultivate. Isn't that just wonderful? So putting the potatoes in the cellar, putting the potatoes in the root cellar, we don't know what the outcome will be. We know that the truth of impermanence is going to prevail. So, planets die, the sun will one day be extinguished, civilizations die. We have the evidence of impermanence in every breath that we take.
For a lot of people, I think, who aren't Buddhists, they often think about this as, well, everything's impermanent, so who cares? So if you think about impermanence, why still act? If it's all basically going to burn up anyway, isn't that almost nihilistic at times? Why should that make us want to put those potatoes away?
When you think about the experience of suffering or of harm, even though one suffering may be impermanent, but one suffering can cause egregious desolation. When I was working intensively with dying people, such a powerful lesson. Everyone I worked with, of course, died. Many of the people that I came alongside had terrible pain or had fears. It didn't mean that I didn't show up, if you know what I'm saying. In other words, just because suffering was there or it would be persistent, we come alongside. We do the best that we can to live within the landscape of possibility, even though the probabilities are maybe not so hopeful in the conventional sense. And that is one of the things that I think is so powerful about wise hope, is that this is a capacity within us to actually live with radical uncertainty.
In work from my lab, we found that holding the belief that your actions can make a difference motivates people to do good in this world. That makes sense. But there's a caution here, a difference between can and will. You see, if you believe that your actions will definitely make a difference, you're setting yourself up for anger or frustration. We're only so big in this world. We can't control everything. The belief that we can underlies anxiety, and often when things don't work out, resentment. Buddhism offers a way around this.
I like so much how Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh translates equanimity. He translates it as inclusivity. So inclusivity means whatever is arising, whatever is being given in any given moment, that is what is the reality of that moment. And one is able to include it as this is the truth of this moment. We don't know what the next moment is going to give us. We are present. We are not turning away from, we are connected to what is happening in the present moment. What is important in terms of our moral character is that we respond from the point of view of our deepest values, from integrity, even if nothing good comes of it.
Hope isn't just an emotion. According to many religions, it's also a virtue. And I think that fits with the point Roshi is making. Hope, in its true sense, isn't just a wish that something happens. It's an expression of our values. It's a feeling that pushes us to act in accord with those values, to do our best to bring them about, recognizing that we might fail sometimes. But what can people do to begin to cultivate that sense of wise hope?
I always think about the difference between an examined life and an unexamined life. This is where I think Western psychology and psychotherapy has so much to lend in terms of our character development. Also, the experience of practice, the meditation of contemplation, of deep looking, of stilling, of bearing witness. And there's a third thing, the value of community. I think we need to rebuild the vitality, the strength of our communities. This is not only our family system, our neighborhoods, but also, in terms of colleagues, the people with whom we work and with whom we serve. I tell you, living in spiritual community since 1979, it's not always support, it's reflection. Boy, you see all your worst characteristics coming to the foreground, just like you do in a primary relationship. And what a community does is it allows you to see yourself from different points of view and to work with the edges that have not been acknowledged in your own experience, but have to be acknowledged in order for the community to be healthy.
But sometimes when we feel truly hopeless, at least for me, it can almost feel paralyzing. Like in that moment, I can't do anything. And I know, as you said, you've been with people who are facing death in their families. You've been an activist for social justice and against war. And so I'm sure you've been around yourself and other people who have had those moments. In those moments, we can't start a meditation practice, right? So for people who are just in that moment of paralysis, do you have any advice for how to take first steps?
When my father died, I was working intensively with dying people at this time. And then my father died. And honestly, that grief that I experienced paralyzed me. I had to actually stop working with dying people. And I just had to heap. I had to just lay down. I did not want to interact with others. I certainly couldn't practice in the conventional sense. It wasn't a matter of me getting on the cushion and making things okay. It was a matter of allowing myself. Actually, I didn't have a choice. It wasn't allowing myself. It was a matter of being worked by grief and not succumbing to the impulse to fix it up, to fix my situation.
In those moments, honoring the pain, not trying to put on a smile, is part of the process. But here again is where community comes in. Sometimes we lose hope, but it's through others that we find it again. It's through their care, their service, their hope for us, and what in turn we give back to them, that we can find a way through. It's a point Roshi remembers the Dalai Lama making at a conference for young leaders from around the world.
And His Holiness kept going back to this theme again and again about how we transform our futility, our hopelessness, through the experience of actually serving others. And this we know actually from the point of view of neuroscience, that if we just stay in the grip of our own grief or anger or anguish, that it brings us further down. And what really serves to uplift us, to transform our own suffering, is endeavoring to be of benefit to others.
Science couldn't agree more. Study after study confirms that helping others is one of the best ways to help ourselves. It allows us to live our morals and try and make the world better. In essence, to have hope. Hope is more than a belief. It's a practice, too. One rooted in empathy care, and perhaps ultimately finding joy for ourselves, people around us, and even those yet to be born. But like any practice, it requires effort and understanding. Effort to push forward in the face of failure and even despair. Understanding to do it correctly. As both our guests point out, chasing hope can be a bumpy road, one that requires a sense of equanimity at times. There are lots of places to find that peace and renewal. A community of family and friends, time in nature's majesty, engaging in meditation or contemplation. It's practices like these that can rebalance us, that can keep hope alive and strong in the coming year. That's it for Season 5 of How God Works. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed what you heard, please give us some stars or share a review wherever you listen. We'll be back with Season 6 in early March. See you then. How God Works is hosted and written by me, Dave DeSteno. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. If you want to learn more, you can find our website at howgodworks, all one word, .org, or follow me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.